So welcome everybody to what is already the 5th session of our seminar series this term. It's week 5 here at Oxford. And we're very pleased to welcome 2 speakers today. Olli Kangas, Professor Olli Kangas from Turku University, and Tim Vlandas, our own Tim Vlandas from this department. Unfortunately, Professor Lena Lavinas has had to cancel today her participation. Unfortunately, she has been suffering from health issues and she's not able to make it. And it's a real pity because actually she's been attending sessions in previous weeks. And so we're really wishing her a quick recovery, and we hope that we'll be able to re-invite her very soon. So let me just quickly introduce the 2 speakers. Olli Kangas has 2 functions at the moment. He's director of the Equal Society Research Program at the Academy of Finland, and he's a professor of practice at the Department of Social Research at the University of Turku. He will be speaking today about universal basic income because he's been closely involved in implementing an experiment that was run in Finland on this policy area, and he worked on it from the social insurance institution of Finland, where he was employed for more than a decade. And before that, he also worked in several universities. And as we were discussing before this session, informally before this session today started, in the early stages of his career, he was also strongly linked to SOFI, so an institution in Stockholm. I can't even remember now what the acronym stands for, but that's, the legendary SOFI team that worked on the decommodification index, Walter Korpi, Espen Andersson, Joachim Palmer, and Olli Kangas. Those are some of the big names that came from that institution. We're really looking forward to hearing from Olli in a few minutes. And just let me quickly also introduce our own Tim Vlandas, who's an associate professor of comparative social policy in this department. Tim has been working on various issues, especially on labor market policies, but recently he's also been conducting research on the politics and particularly political attitudes on universal basic income. He has several papers that have been published on this recently in the Journal of European Social Policy, Basic Income Studies, and the Journal of International and Comparative Social Policy. And some of his work is also forthcoming. And so he will also give us his perspective based on his research after Olli's presentation. But for now, I urge all of you to welcome our 2 speakers from your homes. And so the floor is yours, Olli.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for invitation to participate and to speak about this a minor experiment that we were running in Finland 2017-2018. And I had the not that good position to be the leader or the planning of the experiment. And I must say that it was a rather interesting but very straining process, like an ultra marathon. But I will not speak about marathons. I would like to do, but I would not. I have only 10 minutes. I will say something about the Finnish welfare state very shortly, because it's very important to know in which kind of condition the Finnish experiment was implemented. And also it gives some perspective to that question that what's the fate of welfare, basic income in Finland after the COVID pandemic. And then a little bit about the experiment, because you have to understand about the setup of the experiment in order to understand the results we got. And then something about the results, and then I will give my analysis if there are any possibilities to implement basic income as a consequence of post-COVID-19 or as a consequence of the experiment. So in Finland, we have a dual welfare system in that sense that the basic benefits, they are based at the flat rate principle, and they are paid to everybody who is living in the country, and they have nothing to do with the citizenship, so that every people who is living in Finland and has a residence here, they are entitled to some minimum benefit, irrespective if they are working or not. And on top of that, there are employment and earnings related benefits that are paid for those people who have employment and who have income. So that in a way, I would say that in Finland, we have a kind of basic income to most of people. And then in that respect, the step towards a proper basic income would not be that long in Finland as perhaps in some other countries. When we were planning the experiment, we had 4 different kind of models to analyze and think about. The first one was full basic income that was planned to be something like 1,000 euros, 1,500 euros a month. But then we thought that it's not possible to have such a high level of basic income because the national economic costs would be rather high in that case that we had paid out that much. And also when we were planning the experiment, we had only 20 million euros in our research budget. And in the case that we had such a high level of basic income, the maximum number of people we could have included in our experiment had been something like less than 1,000 persons, and we wanted to have at least 2,000, or we were hoping for to have 10,000 persons. That was then impossible in the end of the day. Then negative income tax was also evaluated, and we did lots of micro simulations analyzing consequences of those different models. But at that time, we didn't have in Finland a proper income register based on monthly or weekly wages or income. But just now we have, and in fact, it were possible to have very nice possibilities to have negative income tax because we have that updated income register working now. And then some other models, participation income, what Anthony Atkinson proposed, but then we thought that, okay, it's impossible to experiment with because we don't have that kind of bureaucratic capacity to screen what people are doing. And if they are doing that kind of things that we should pay something for. And then we ended up to partial basic income and thought that something like 550, 600 euros a month would be a minimum that could be paid for those people who are participating in the experiment. And in that case, we calculated that we could have something like 2,000, 3,000 persons included in the experiment, so that there were lots of practical reasons behind that decision, and also some political reasons and legal reasons too. The final setting was that the amount of the basic income that we paid unconditionally out was 560 euros net a month. And in the case that those social benefits that people were getting could be or would be more than 560 euros. In that case, Social Insurance Institution of Finland would pay the difference. And it was obligatory, a nationwide random sampling. We took out of those about 200,000 unemployed people who were getting social unemployment benefits or Social Insurance Institution of Finland. We randomly selected 2,000 unemployed from there, and they were obliged to be in the experiment up to the bitter end of the experiment 2018. It started 2017. So that we have the control group and we have the treatment group. So that in that sense, it's rather a strong experiment. There are very many problems with the experiment, but it's in that sense strong that we have identical groups that we are comparing, and because it's obligatory, there is not selection bias at all. Okay, the government wanted to we study employment effects, if basic income is good for employment. And therefore, we put lots of effort to evaluate the effects, employment effects in the experiment. And here, if you look at the upper hand panel, during the first year, there are no big difference whatsoever. In the very beginning of the experiment, in the beginning of 2017, no differences whatsoever. But then during the second year, there are some differences between the treated and the controls. And the lower panel here shows what the differences are and if they are significant or not. And the main conclusion was that there are no significant employment effects if you look at the whole group of people and compare the treated with the control group. But there were interesting differences in some groups. For example, immigrants or among immigrants and among those who were getting basic income and who had children and who had families, the employment effect was significant. So that it was rather an interesting results we got in those different groups. And then if we are then trying to understand why some persons found employment and some other persons didn't find employment, we did some analysis where we asked people that what's the self-rated or self-evaluation of the employability and ability to work. And those who said that they have very, very low ability to work, there seems to be no difference whatsoever between the treated and the controls. But in the case that there is some ability left to work, in that case, there are some differences. And our conclusion is that in this group that we had included in our experiment, it's very important that there is ability to work. And then the first conclusion is that the decent level of income is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for employment in this group. And those people, they need social health care, employment and education and all kind of training and social services in order to find employment. So that it's not only to give basic income to them, to those people who were our target in the experiment, but they need something much more. Then we also tried to see phenomenological effects in that sense that we looked at trust, because somebody is saying that trust is a very important thing in our lives. And I somehow think that if John Lennon and Paul McCartney had been sociologists, the most cited article they had written had been, all you need is trust. And if you look here, we can take a look at the yellow part here. the trust in social security legal system, police, the European Union, parliament, politicians, political parties, other people. In all those respects, those who were treated, they have much higher and significantly higher trust level than the other persons who were in the control group. And then also we look at the confidence and perceptions of own capabilities and capacities. That if people are confident in their own future economic situation and coping with different difficult life situations, and also there are significant differences between the treated and the controls. And also capabilities, what Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have nicely written about. We studied if people are thinking that they have capacities to have a meaningful job and find a job and to improve the level of living and to have some influence in the surrounding society in all those respects, again, a significant difference. And then to come back to that question that was given to us, that if basic income is politically feasible, post-pandemic relations and post-pandemic situation in Finland or in some other countries, the one thing is political feasibility that Jürgen de Vispela and Jose Noguera has written about. If we take the first one, the strategic feasibility, it's as Max Weber said, that if we want to have significant effects, we must have significant and strong groups that are supporting the idea, but in the Finnish case, it's not there. The only political parties that are supporting basic income are the Greens and the Leftwing party that will get something like 20% of the votes, so that there are no buffer groups behind the idea. Institutional feasibility, at which background institutions must be eliminated in order to get basic income, and it's so that too many strong social institutions must be replaced. For example, in Finland we have a voluntary unemployment insurance scheme, and the insurance funds, unemployment funds, are run by trade unions. And in that case, joining unemployment fund is an incentive to join the trade union. And in fact, trade union density in Finland is the highest in the world. And therefore, trade unions are very strongly against basic income. There may be some other reasons too, but I think that this one. And then psychological feasibility, that if people are supporting basic income, and it depends very much how we ask. If we ask that basic income is basic income a good thing, and the Finns, 80% of the Finns will say that it's good. But if you then tell that there are some flip sides of the coin, in that case they say that no, and something like 30% of the people are now saying that basic income is good. And then behavioral feasibility, if basic income experiment produced strong evidence that the behavioral consequences are that kind that they are good for society, in that case we could implement basic income, but the employment effects, as we saw, they were not strong enough, and at least the government that we had, it didn't count that much on the psychological and other aspects of the experiment. And then there are questions that and deliberations in many countries that this pandemic will facilitate the implementation of basic income. But that's not the case in Finland. And the reason is that the basic security covers already everybody, and only very small minor reforms have been done to adjust the existing social security system to meet the challenges caused by the pandemic. So that in very many other countries, they have implemented much more new reforms to combat the pandemic, but not that much in Finland. And the political perception is that the existing system is working very well. And in the case that the pandemic will not destroy the whole country, in that case, I think that the perception will be valid. And instead of having basic income, they will do some other adjustment. So that I think that for the time being, basic income is not the is not the major issue in the political social policy agenda of the Finnish policymakers. And if you want to know something more, there's a very nice YouTube that will tell everything much better than I did here. So that this was my fairy tale today.
Thanks very much. I think a lot of people will have a lot of questions later on this, but for now, I'll ask Tim to also share his thoughts on the political aspects, politics of UBI.
Okay, thanks, Marek. Let me know if the sound and the screen are good. And hi, everyone. As you can see, I'm not Elina Levinas, as Marek said, had to cancel yesterday evening. And so Marek and Rosella asked me a few hours ago, in fact, if I could step in, which is my pleasure to do so. So I guess my presentation now is fairly complementary to what Olli just said. Is looking more, not so much at the effects, but at the likely politics. And just to remind us, these are the kind of standard 5 characteristics of a universal basic income. It has to be universal, given to everyone, unconditional, not means tested or based on prior contributions. It has to entail regular cash payments. And typically, most of the time, it's advocated to be given on an individual level. And there's quite a large literature going back a few centuries, in fact, concerning the normative desirability, the moral reasons under which it might be legitimate to include a universal basic income. And there's quite a lot of work in the last 50, 60 years, starting in the 60s, 70s, but picking up speed recently, including in Finland, looking at the economic desirability. Is it a good idea? What kind of effects can we expect it to have? But also, is it feasible? Is it feasible in terms of the effect it does have? Is it feasible fiscally in terms of how much it might cost? But I suspect, except for a few exceptions, from my perspective, and that's my starting point here, there wasn't so much on the political feasibility of it, and in particular on the kind of social coalitions one might expect to be either in support, the strong social groups Olli was referring to early on, or at the very least not totally opposed to the idea of a universal basic income. And I think that's important theoretically because we have a large literature in political economy and social policy and political science and also sociology, looking at the conditions under which individuals are more or less favorable to existing welfare state policies, social insurance, social assistance, but not so much on a universal basic income that doesn't yet exist. And we also, in a way, want to know more about political feasibility from a practical perspective, because we all know that policies that government choose in the end are partly informed by evidence, but more often than not, politics drive the shows, at least for policies that are not in so-called quiet politics. So this is a sort of simplified starting point. You can imagine different individuals being exposed to different kinds of labor market risks. They're more or less likely to become unemployed. They're more or less likely to be in precarious work. They're more or less likely to need the welfare state in some form. That's one dimension. And the other dimension is whether individuals are more or less earning, above or below a median income, say. And typically, the literature in political economy expects people with low income and high risks to really be strong supporters of the welfare state, and then people with high income but the low risk to be strongly opposing the welfare state. And then you have a bunch of people who are probably cross-pressured. If I have high income but I'm facing high risks, I could have social insurance motivations for wanting benefits and supporting social interventions. If I am low income and low risk, I might support the welfare state mostly for redistributive purposes. So one question is, do these classical conflict lines travel to the case of a universal basic income? There's two complications in the case of a basic income one could think about when theorizing different expectations one might have. The first one is that the policy in, by and large does not exist, not in this ideal type form that I defined early on, which begs the question, do individuals understand whether a policy such as a UBI will benefit them, given that they don't really experience it currently? And subsequently, is it the case that expectations that we have about social policies that do exist, that people have experienced and they understand the structure of the policy, do these expectations travel to the case of a universal basic income? We have then a second further complication, which is that the devil is in the detail. In a sense, even if you're thinking, well, going back to this graph I had early on, if I have a low income, should I support a universal basic income? Well, if you just think of an individual being given a permanent, universal, unconditional benefit, they might support it, but of course it depends how the benefit is structured, how it's financed. You could imagine cases where if it is meant to replace existing benefits, individuals might actually not benefit so much from a universal basic income relative to how they benefited from the existing welfare state, right? So you have a problem of inexistence of the policy, and you have a problem of an existing institutional setup that might change the cost-benefit calculations of people. So what I want to do is just tell us a little bit more about what I think was conflict-like lines look like in the data we do have. So in the European Social Survey, covering most European countries, there is a wave, which was carried out in 2016, where respondents are asked whether they are against or in favor of a universal basic income scheme. And they're given quite a lot of characteristics that are relevant here. They're told that it is monthly, that it is cash, that it is of a certain level. Crucially, stacking the cards slightly against supporting the benefit, they are told that it would replace many other social benefits. They are told something about the level of the benefit, the unconditionality, both in terms of prior contributions and in terms of labor market participation. They also told something about financing here from general taxes. If you look at the average for European countries here, you see there is, a kind of even split actually. About 47% are in favor, 46% are against, and then 6-7% don't know. So we have a slight majority across European countries, but a very, very small one. If you kick out the don't knows, you get 51-52% in favor and 48-49%, depending on how you cut it, who are against. So a question then comes, how does it vary across countries? This is plotting the cross-national variation. And you see you have high support in some Baltic and Central and Eastern European countries, so Lithuania pretty high, Hungary, Slovenia, but also some of the Southern European, Portugal, and even Belgium is pretty high. So not a very clear, consistent picture, especially since you also have low support in other Eastern European countries. And similarly for Scandinavia, quite a bit of variation as well. Norway is pretty low. But others are not perhaps as low. Finland slightly higher. It's probably also more salient in light of what we heard before. So there's variation across countries, and we might then want to think about variation across individuals. So if we run a logistic regression analysis of support for universal basic income as a function of different social demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, we find that older people tend to be less supportive. People with higher income are also less supportive. Individuals who identify as being more right-wing are less supportive as well. Some other noteworthy characteristics here that are coming out. People on benefits are more supportive, but interestingly enough, not a statistically significant effect of being a temporary worker. And similarly, for occupations, it's not clear you have a very strongly different picture depending on which occupations you're looking at. Trade union member comes in the, in a non-significant category as well. I'll have more to say about this later. And more educated individuals, when controlling for these other things, slightly more supportive, and this is actually significant as well. Precarious workers who are more supportive of a lot of benefits are not more supportive of universal basic income. So this is the picture we get in terms of significance, in terms of magnitudes. All these variables have been rescaled by the standard deviation, so the coefficients are comparable. And I could also tell you more about the effects in terms of predicted probability. So if you take the minimum, maximum differences, for instance, you get an 18-year-old being perhaps a 60%, having a 60% probability of supporting a universal basic income versus 47% for someone who's 65-year-old. The difference for gender, as you can see, is pretty small. 52% for male, 49.8% for females. This is actually a surprise as well, because one would have expected female to be more supportive, female respondents, because often the welfare state doesn't necessarily cover many of the social risks as adequately as one might wish for. On the basis of this initial picture, we can then further think about the likely politics by introducing institutions and ideology. In terms of institutions, it seems that universal basic income, everything else being equal, tends to exhibit higher support in countries where welfare state policies are either less generous or less decommodifying as a result of activation of unemployment benefits, for instance, right? So here we get a picture where the higher the gaps in the effectiveness of the welfare state in protecting individuals, the higher the average level in support that you can observe across countries. We could also think of other ideological factors. Individuals who have pro-immigration attitudes tend to have higher support for universal basic income, and higher trust is also positively correlated with support, as we find actually for other welfare state policies. In fact, in many ways, well, not in all ways, if we look at support for universal basic income and see how it correlates with other kinds of pro-welfare state attitudes, having more egalitarian views, being more favorable to welfare state benefits, or more having more positive views of recipients, they all load strongly positively on supporting a universal basic income. Why should we care about these findings? I think theoretically it's important because it adds up a more political leg on focusing on public opinion and its drivers to a literature that has focused mostly, although not exclusively, on normative desirability and economic feasibility and its effects. And I think from a political economy perspective, what struck me is that one could say, well, individuals do not understand the policy, it's very complicated, they do not know what kind of effects it should have, and therefore the political economy expectations shouldn't travel. Except that I have just shown you, by and large, our expectations are met. So we do find that low income, higher risk individuals are more supportive of a basic income, which also tells you something about how individuals perceive the scheme. They do perceive it as being more redistributive and protective, since the members that are most vulnerable and most reliant on the welfare state already tend to be more supportive of a basic income. I think there are also briefly some implications on the politics of UBI. I think if you look at the average support, which is very high in some countries, there's a paradox of appeal, what I call a paradox of appeal, which pertains to strange non-success of a universal basic income. So we know, going back to Copy and Palm, since they were mentioned early on, the more universal a benefit, the more politically appealing it should be in a way, which begs two questions. Why is support not larger everywhere? But more importantly, why the UBI doesn't manage to get introduced even in countries with large support. So one could remember, for instance, Benoît Hamon, wanted to introduce it. Unfortunately, he had a fairly terrible score, but he also had a referendum in Switzerland. So you have a lot of failures, political failures of introducing the benefits. And I think there's three possible solutions to this surprising non-success. One perhaps has to do with what we know about the politics of the welfare state and the perceived or real austerity that we've been having since for 10, 15 years. Another one could be that you have an unidentified constraints on the political supply, that parties, for whatever reason, do not find it useful, by and large, to mobilize around this idea. And that echoes the small political support it had in Finland with the Greens, as Olli was saying. But even in France, only a socialist party really supported it, and that was at a time where it did very poorly. But I think on the basis of what I've just shown you, there's a third explanation, which is about how the different conflict lines in the support coalition might create problems on the demand side. So here you see that to have high support for universal basic income in a country, this is the average for the country, more often than not, you need high support among the left, right? So in countries that do not have high support among the left, it's very difficult to get a UBI. So fine, you need support from the left, and you also need support from trade union members for similar reason. In fact, the correlation is even stronger. And that leads to a potential paradox, which is that if you do not have very high support from trade union members and the left, you then need some sort of a cross-class coalition, which is very difficult to do. You see here again, lots of variation in the extent to which you have left-wing voters and trade union members being supportive, but by and large, in most countries, trade union members are less supportive than the average left-wing voter. Why is that a problem? That's a problem because actually the high support we're seeing is hiding some strong splits within the left. And this then requires forming a coalition between the left and the right. And this coalition is very difficult to operationalize. So first of all, why might we have trade union skepticism, where there's a bunch of reasons which Yannick van der Borg and others have looked at? It might be that a basic income undermines union roles in established welfare state institutions. It might be that they weaken the wage bargaining role. Some have questioned what kind of wage level effects they would have if you had a proper introduction of a UBI. And you also have questions about whether and how unions relate to the value of work and what it means to get a benefit when you're not working. If that's the case, then left-leaning UBI supporters, and that's my final point, are not sufficiently large in most cases to create a strong pro-UBI coalition, which then means that the coalition you observe in terms of the support has to draw on the right-wing parts of the electorate. But the problem, of course, is that different parts of the electorate might support UBI for very different reasons. So typically the left supports it because it's highly decommodifying and it might address gaps in the welfare state, whereas the right supports it because it sees it as a kind of low tax, low benefit, entrepreneurial friendly kind of policy, right? And so as soon as it's introduced and the arguments are made about the different reasons why you might want a UBI, and as soon as you get into the detail, this coalition experiences a split, and as a result, that doesn't fare very well for what's going to happen now. So in post-COVID world, we could expect increasing political feasibility on the one hand, because crises often constitute a critical juncture. You have raising labor market risks, rising precariousness, and rising unemployment. That's going to lead to an increase in demand for protection, especially as the welfare state experiences heightened gaps in its coverage, especially among young and gig workers. On the other hand, you could have decreasing political feasibility because you have limited fiscal capacity, and you've already had quite a lot of policy innovations in a lot of countries, which begs the question, is there political capital to be invested into backing a really new and radical policy, especially in the context where we might have other policy priorities? And it seems that overall, in terms of the surveys we get and the media attention we're getting, recently, since the pandemic started, we seem to be in a picture where the former effect dominates. So the factors pushing for greater support are there, they are increasing, and you see that this is much higher level of support than what we had in the European Social Survey in 2016, although these are not directly comparable, of course. But notwithstanding this, you still have the paradox of large appeal, which might be hiding significant conflict lines within this wider support. So if you want to read more about these things, this was a bit of a mix and match of different papers, and I must acknowledge also the contribution of our co-authors here, Hanna Schwender, Leire Rincon, and Heikki Hillemo, who have informed my thinking on this issue. Thanks so much for listening. You're muted, Marek.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Tim. Very, very interesting. And I think really those two presentations actually nicely complement each other. It may actually be that the two people who presented, Tim and Olli, will have questions to each other, and you should also feel free to ask those questions. But for now, so we'll end the recording, and we'll basically we open the floor to questions.